I'm going to survive 100 days inside of Minecraft Hardcore with a 1.18 world generation. Well, I'm gonna try to, at least. Mojang released a data pack allowing us to access 1.18 world generation before the official release date later this year. In this world, the caves are twice as deep as before, and the new world generation is crazy. Will I survive, or will I find my untimely demise? Let's find out in Minecraft Hardcore. Here we are, the beginning, day 0. Why does everybody skip day 0? Anyways, logistics aside, I started the normal way by punching this tree until I could craft a wooden pickaxe. However, the wooden pick didn't last long because I immediately mined stone to make an upgrade. I made the rest of my tools, mined the first copper of this world, and stumbled into this dark cave, finding various bits of iron, coal, and copper, and to my pleasant surprise, no monsters. Having reached dead ends in all directions, I resurfaced where I gathered more wood, collected sugarcane, and sacrificed this chicken for my personal gain. I cooked the chicken, made a flint and steel, and set off on an arsenic rage to collect as much cooked food as I could find. But nighttime was here, and rather than sleeping, I made a boat and set off on an adventure to find new land. I eluded a couple of ruined portals along the way and finished the night collecting some dark oak wood. Pretty successful first day. On day 1, I did more exploring. I found my first underwater cave and hopped in to take a look, but didn't really find much, and I ended up settling here on the edge of a forest where I put down a chest and got working on some early game farms. However, night was approaching fast, so I immediately started digging down to look for resources where I stumbled into this very sketchy ravine. I proactively began lighting up the upper half of the ravine to prevent creeper dive bombs and spent the rest of the day exploring the nearby caves. I had kind of a close call with a skeleton, but I came out on top. On day 2, I continued exploring caves, which naturally led into an abandoned mine shaft that I was less than equipped to conquer. I bravely explored it anyways because I am a strong man. Oh my god, there's a cave spider, I'm out of here. Instead, I backed off, finished my set of armor, and then went back exploring. The first chest I found had glowberries in them, which I was very excited about. Despite this poisonous encounter with the cave spider, I kept exploring until day 3 I stumbled into the first deep slate cave. This was exciting because it meant we were officially below level 0, which was the reason why I was playing this data pack to begin with. These caves were large and dangerous. I found this massive open cave where I found the first diamonds of the series. I fought off a horde of skeletons before finding even more diamonds above me. Do you know how weird it is to find diamonds on the ceiling? Anyways, I love this cave so much that I decided to make it my own, so I started digging a staircase all the way to the surface for ease of access. I finally felt fresh air at the end of day 3, and to my surprise, I was right next to my initial camp on the surface. Day 4, I reharvested my crops and used some bone meal to grow more wheat so that I could officially start a cow farm. Luckily for me, Adam and Eve were close, so it was an easy task to corral them into a fenced-off area. Now free of my sins, I set off and committed more arson in the nearby animal pasture to collect some more early game food. I then went back into my future home where a creeper instantly dive-bombed me from behind and exploded me into a zombie. I told you, this place is dangerous. Now free of sins and urine, I spent the next bit carefully lighting up and mob-proofing this entire area. I quickly ran out of coal and realized that coal no longer generates below Y0, so I went back up to higher caves and collected as much as I could. I spent the morning of day 5 lighting up more of my cave until I ran out of coal again. Yeah, this lack of coal was going to turn into a real problem. I resurfaced and spent the afternoon exploring where I collected the first spruce tree of the world and began luring this sheep back home. Except I was going the wrong way and I got lost, so I frantically ran home once nighttime hit. Having not slept yet, I was immediately greeted with some new friends that I happily took out and even got a phantom membrane out of it. That would come in handy later. I spent some time collecting more coal and then finished the rest of the night doing some chores and safeguarding around the surface area. On day 6, I explored the nearby area and found a ruined portal which had a golden apple in it. I collected the gold blocks too and immediately spotted cobblestone in a cave right on the surface. Lo and behold, we had ourselves a zombie spawner, which I was absolutely going to use for an XP farm later. I continued along in my boat where I found this shipwreck that had carrots, potatoes, and moss blocks, all of which I needed in abundance. I kept going, and by the end of the night, I found an acacia tree and gathered a few saplings, which would come in handy later. I spent a chunk of day 7 returning back home, where I immediately started farming moss blocks. I then spent the rest of the night continuing to expand my light into nearby caves and planted saplings to get an easy source of wood down in the cave. On day 8, I smelted all of my copper and began gathering the items I planned to build with, and then began construction of my house. I wanted the build to be tucked into this corner so that I could have a safe way in and out of the base at some point. I kept gathering and building, and by the end of the day, the front facade was pretty complete and looking rather nice. I started off day 9 by building up and removing this lava so it wouldn't painfully kill me, and then spent the rest of the day continuing to work on my house. It was a slow process, but I was really liking how things looked at this point. On day 10, I finished the outside of the house and added a little bit of detail to the inside, and then started clearing out the back, which would ultimately be my way up and down from this place. I was sick of the staircase at this point, so I started digging straight up to the surface to get a fast way down here. On day 11, I emerged at the surface right next to my starter area. Honestly, I couldn't have planned this any better if I tried. I dug all the way back down, put a sign and a water bucket in place, and just like that, we had a fast entry into the cave base. This meant one thing, in that it was officially moving day. So I broke my cows free and one by one pushed them into the abyss. I cleared out some space next to my house, put down some fences, and just like that, I had an official cow farm down here. I spent day 12 gathering more food and collecting wood at the surface because trees don't grow that well in dark caves, it turns out. I then went back into the cave and began terraforming and outlining a large area on the opposite side of my house. This was going to be my crop farm. But last time I checked, crops don't grow on deep slate, so I spent most of day 13 collecting more dirt than I thought I would ever need. I also found my first village of the world, which I happily raided for its hay bales and beds. I finally added windows to my humble abode and spent the rest of the evening replacing every block of deep slate with the dirt I collected. I spent the beginning of day 14 filling in the rest of the dirt, and then I went up to the surface to get my crops. I then had to figure out where the water would go, so I began digging these channels offset just behind the dirt so it was not visible. One by one, I placed water sources until the entire top layer was hydrated, and then I planted my seeds. I spent the rest of day 14 and even into day 15 hydrating and planting the remaining layers despite not having enough crops to fully do so. I took a little break to detail my cow farm with some moss and glowberries and even added some azalea leaves to decorate my house a bit. I spent the rest of day 15 clearing out more space in my backyard and placed down some chests to get proper storage in place. On day 16, I began moving all of my items into the storage area to declutter things a bit. I was also tired of getting jumped from monsters above me, so I went closer to the surface and began strip mining for coal. Yeah, that didn't work. I ended up having to smelt logs to make charcoal, which I then used to make torches and light up a bunch of the caves above me. I even made a safe way up and down here with water, which didn't look great, but it worked for now. On day 17, I explored into the massive cave below me, and despite its dangers, I did manage to get it pretty well lit and even found some diamonds along the way. I spent the next 8 hours down there getting enough obsidian for a nether portal and an enchantment table. I returned to the surface, began expanding my crop farm some more, and oh my god, there's a witch chasing me. I got out my bow, took cover behind this pillar, and eventually took out the sorcerer. Crisis averted. Then I had the bright idea to build up a nether portal and head straight into literal hell. And that's pretty much what it was, considering I was on the edge of a basalt delta bordering a giant lava lake. Yeah, I went back to the overworld and took the L on day 17. But it was a new day, and that day was 18, so I went back into the nether, destroyed my initial portal, built all the way up into the ceiling, and replaced it so I could at least breathe easier. I then spent an eternity digging in a straight line and easing my way down until I finally busted out into a semi-safe territory on the edge of this warp forest. Finally, on day 19, after this rather dangerous encounter with a magma cube that did give me some magma cream, I managed to find soul sand. I hurried home and dug straight up to the surface and then straight back down to expose a one wide hole. I bred my cows and killed my cows until I was left with a small army of children that I would later exploit. On day 20, I got a boat, used this clunky staircase one last time, and headed off in search of kelp. While I was out, I also swung by the jungle to grab wood, cocoa beans, melons, and bamboo. Once home, I put down all the kelp, replaced the bottom with soul sand, and officially had a fast way up to the surface. This was gonna save me so much time. I spent the rest of the day farming crops and gathering more obsidian to make an enchantment table. On day 21, I set off to capture a local villager so I could use them to start a new underground civilization. This was tedious and took all day though, so I spent the night working on the eventual collection area for the villager breeder and also did some expansion on my crop fields. I surfaced bright and early on day 22, made sure our friend didn't die, and set off to adopt another villager. Once again, this was a slow process, and by the time I got back, night was upon me. But I braved it out and began collecting materials and building up the walls of the villager breeder. On day 23, I started building the roof and then went down to steal some carrots so my villagers would make some love. I added in this little entrance so I could check on them every once in a while. I collected some wool, made some beds, and started planting my carrots. On day 24, I got more wool to make another bed and then fixed the bed placement so that the villagers could actually reproduce. I hopped into the drop chute and started digging a tunnel until I was directly in line with the collection area in the cave base. I put down signs, placed in the water buckets, and then dug straight up from below to make sure I had things lined up. I dug back down, put in some water for obvious reasons, and then filled in the glass wall. On day 25, I collected sugarcane and gathered my wood so that I could make some bookshelves. I then put down the enchantment table, installed the bookshelves, and just like that, I was ready to make some enchantments. I used my first 30 level enchant on my pickaxe and got Silk Touch, which was nice, but really I was after fortune because of how scarce diamonds had been. At this point, I wanted to go strip mining for diamonds, so I went down into the big cave below me and started digging at level -54 because I noticed that was lava level. It wasn't wildly successful, but I did manage to find a handful of resources along the way. On On day 26, I went back to the zombie spawner and started clearing it out to make the XP grinder. Now that I can enchant things, I really needed a good source of levels. This is pretty much the age-old dungeon farm design. Do I even really have to explain it at this point? It was a little awkward though, since the water tunnel extended over the surface, but by the end of the night, I was ready to remove the torches and turn this bad boy on. On day 27, I gathered a few more levels and then went back home. Along the way, I noticed that the villagers were actually failing to breed, so I removed the ceiling above the beds and instantly they popped out a child. All I had to do was raise it up by one. I took a chance with another diamond pick and yeah, I got silk touch again. Oh boy. Needless to say, I spent the rest of the night collecting more levels at the XP grinder. I spent the morning of day 28 re-rolling enchantments until I finally had Fortune 3 lined up, but of course I needed more levels, so I spent the next long while back at the XP grinder until I could finally afford this enchantment. I spent the rest of the night caving with my new pickaxe, mining as much coal and copper as I could find. On day 29, I went back into my strip mine to gather resources and ended up in these pretty sketchy caves. I fought off a ton of monsters, collected a bunch of resources, and honestly just had fun exploring the new cave generation. It was a bit buggy though, but I mean, this floating lava did look pretty cool. Also terrifying. On day 30, I continued exploring, collecting, and fighting until, you guessed it, I ran out of torches. That was a bit of a bummer, but I returned home and fortuned the 14 diamond ore I collected while I was out. I got 35 diamonds, bringing our total up to 46, which meant that I had more than enough for a full set of diamond armor and tools, which I promptly made. I spent the rest of the night fortuning the rest of the ores I collected while I was out. On day 31, I enchanted my diamond boots and got protection 4, unbreaking 3, and depth strider, which I was totally thrilled about. Now out of levels, yet again, I changed things up and started clearing an area to house some of my villagers. I put down some rails, swung in with a minecart, and just like that, I had the first one in place. I made this villager a farmer, so I spent a bit harvesting my crops and then traded for some emeralds. I put another villager in place, and although they were still a child, I decided they would be a fletcher when they grew up. On day 32, I traded some sticks, planted melons and pumpkins, and put another villager in place. This one would be a librarian. I did some safeguarding and then re-rolled the lectern until I got a mending trade. I used the XP from trading to enchant my helmet and ended up with respiration 3 and aqua infinity, along with unbreaking 3 and fire protection. I spent the entirety of day 33 getting more levels at the zombie grinder. This thing was painstakingly slow. I returned home on day 34 with 33 levels so I could enchant my pants and my chest plate, both of which got protection 3, which I was okay with for now. Then I replaced the ugly water stream with a much better looking water elevator to help me get to the upper caves. At that point, I began building the bridge over to my enchanting setup, and after outlining the shape with the netherrack, I started building up the support pillars. On day 35, I began outlining the bridge in deep slate tiles because I love the texture of them. I added walls for safety and then replaced the netherrack with moss blocks, which although they were a weird choice, I loved the pop of color that they provided. I added in some slabs, and at this point, I was pretty happy with how this turned out. Definitely an improvement from before. I spent the rest of the day trading with my villagers and breeding my cows until I had 30 levels, which I then used to enchant my axe. On day 36, I went out and stole more beds from the village for a future project, and then spent the rest of the day wandering aimlessly through the nether in search of another fortress. I was totally not successful in my endeavors and ended up having to dig through the basalt delta to hopefully find new terrain. I continued digging and bridging all the way into day 37 where I finally found a structure, except it was a bastion. Ugh. At this point, I was almost 700 blocks from my portal, however, so I changed directions, continued digging, and finally noticed the fortress out in front of me. I spent a long time carefully constructing a safe way up and down to this thing, and then I entered the fortress. By now, it was day 38, and I spent some time roaming around this place fighting wither skeletons until I finally stumbled upon a blaze spawner. I didn't have any fire resistance on me, but I was confident in my strafing ability, plus the fire protection on my armor would come in handy. Despite spending a lot of time on fire, I hung out there until I had 21 blaze rods and plenty of levels. On the way back, I killed another wither skeleton who actually dropped their head, which was unexpected but cool. I spent the rest of the day making the long trek back home. I spent the first half of day 39 re-rolling enchantments and wasting all of my hard-earned levels until I had looting lined up for a sword, but of course I needed more XP. So I spent the next long while at the sleepy XP farm until I had 30 levels to make this sword enchant. It was only looting 2, but that was better than nothing. I immediately went back into the nether with my new sword and started killing endermen in the warped forest so I could get some ender pearls. On day 40, I hurried home, made my eyes of ender, and then started gathering what I would need for the dragon fight. I even brewed some slow falling potions with my phantom membranes that I had collected, which would definitely come in handy. I spent the rest of the night re-rolling enchantments until I had infinity lined up on a bow. On day 41, I killed my cows and bred my cows until I had 30 levels so I could make my bow enchantment. I made some final checks, set my spawns so I could return home easily, and then set off to find the stronghold. I traveled bravely through the jungle into the night, following the path laid by my ender eyes. Just on the edge of the jungle, I noticed I was lying lined up with the stronghold. I began digging down and immediately fell all the way down into this ravine, losing over half of my hearts. If I fell just a few more blocks here, this whole run would have been over. I healed up, continued digging down, this time with a much safer staircase, and then just below Y level 0, I found my way into the stronghold. This thing was scuffed. All 3 of the pathways leading out of the main room led to a dead end, which meant I had to resort to digging in hopes to find new hallways. Luckily, I found more to explore and spent the rest of the day wandering aimlessly through this labyrinth. On day 42, I found this half-generated dungeon, but there wasn't a spawner, which was odd. I spent the next long while continuing to explore, and just as I was about to give up and take that L, I stumbled right into the portal room. This was a nightmare to find. I activated the end portal, gathered some obsidian to make an ender chest for extra storage, and then jumped through the portal at the start of day 43. Immediately, I built over to the main island, staircased up, and then drank a slow falling potion. I also put on a pumpkin head, and before anyone complains, yes, I do have the resource pack to hide the pumpkin image because nobody wants to look at that. Despite not having very great aim, the fight went pretty smoothly. It wasn't long before I had all the healing towers destroyed and I was able to start shooting the dragon. I did get absolutely yeeted into the air though, and I had to ender pearl down to the ground because my slow falling was running out. It wasn't long though before I shot the last arrow and officially took out the dragon. I wasn't done yet though, so I immediately staircased up to the end gateway, tossed in an ender pearl, and set off to find an end city. I finally found one at the end of day 43, but it was just a small one, so I killed the shulkers and continued exploring. On the morning of day 44, there it was, the infamous end ship loaded into the distance, and I could not have been happier. I ran over to it, built up, and gathered my pair of wings. This felt so good. I killed a few more shulkers for their shells and continued looting the end city before deciding I ought to just head back home where things are safer. I gathered the dragon egg back at the main island and then jumped into the portal where I ended up safe and sound back at the cave base. I immediately added mending and unbreaking 3 to my wings and then spent the rest of the night decorating my bridge some more. On day 45, I brewed a bunch of fire resistance potions, made some upgrades to my tools, and then headed into the nether in search of ancient debris. I dug a staircase down, avoiding multiple pits of lava until I was on Y level 15, in which case I dug out a little room, drank a potion, and started mining. The potions definitely came in handy. I spent the rest of day 45, 46, 47, and partially into day 48 mining all the ancient debris I could find. I headed home with 27 ancient debris, which I thought was pretty good. I began smelting them down to netherite scraps, fully harvested my crop fields, and then made 6 netherite ingots, which I promptly put on my full set of armor, my sword, and a pickaxe. On day 49, I began clearing out the kill chamber for the iron farm I was planning to make. I dug straight up to the surface and then spent the next while digging a 3x3 hole all the way down into the chamber for the golems to fall through. On day 50, I collected some sand for glass and then began outlining the iron farm design. This is a relatively simple iron farm design from Logical Geek Boy's Simply Minecraft series, which I will have a link for in the description. I built up the center chamber for the zombie and then got to work on the spawning platform for the golems themselves. It was nighttime though, so I quickly built the staircase and lured a zombie into the chamber. On day 51, I built a minecart staircase to help get the villagers in place and then set up a track down in the cave base to help the villagers get to the surface. I used the furnace minecart to push the villagers all the way up into their forever home on top of the bed. Only 5 more to go. It wasn't long before I had the first side filled in and then started building over to the other side. And then I realized my zombie despawned, which was unfortunate because they were holding a shovel, which I thought meant they couldn't do that. On day 52, I noticed one of my villagers escaped, so after getting them back into place, I started getting the rest of them, except I forgot to depower the activator rail, so now I had 2 villagers in 1 holding cell. Let the nightmares begin. That night, I got another zombie in place, this time holding an item that I threw at it, and by now the villagers were mostly in place, so I started building up the walls of the iron farm. I spent almost all of day 53 continuing to build up the walls around the iron farm, and of course the villagers were escaping because I had blocks next to their beds. Finally, by the end of day 54, I had the villagers in place, standing on their beds so they couldn't go anywhere. On day 55, I removed a couple of the excess villagers as well as this iron golem so I could start clearing out the drop chamber for the golems. I filled in this water and started digging down a ways and then began tunneling to line myself up with the drop chute I dug out previously. I put down a bunch of signs and started filling in the water streams. On day 56, I put in the rest of the water and then started working on the killing chamber. Basically, the golems fell into a water stream that takes them over to a lava blade which would kill them, giving me all their drops. Finally, that night, I installed the fence gates and put the water streams on the spawn platforms and then set the zombie free so I could test out the farm. The spawning did work, but I needed to extend the platforms out by 1 to prevent the golems from getting caught on my walls. Honestly, I really shouldn't have built these walls in the first place. On day 57, I waited around to verify the water streams worked, and to my surprise, they actually did, kind of. I then spent some time harvesting my crop fields and watching some of the golems burn, which was oddly satisfying. I also added a little bit of detail to the bridge with some bone meal. On day 58, I added a few minor improvements to the spawning pads and then fixed the water streams in this corner where the golems were getting caught up a bit. Finally, after nearly 10 full days of work, this thing was fully operational and ready to start pumping out massive amounts of iron. I spent the next while lighting up more caves near the base. This was pretty much turning into a never-ending task. On day 59, I stole some iron to make some lanterns for decoration and then started landscaping below the bridge to fill in a pond. I added a bunch of moss and then began filling in water sources until the pond was 3 or 4 blocks deep. I also added in some glow lichen to help light up the bottom of the pond a bit. On day 60, I set off to capture some axolotls and then put them in my pond to add a little bit more life to the area. I did some more trading so I could buy another mending book and then did a bit more decorating around the pond. I also began outlining the main path for the cave base using moss, which I liked but still wasn't sold on. And that brings us to day 61, where I continued outlining the shape of the path with more moss and then spent a while at the surface gathering azalea leaves so that I could build a custom tree. I've built plenty of custom trees before this, but this was the first one that utilized the new leaf textures, and I think it was my favorite one yet. It also added a lot of life to the otherwise lifeless cave base. On day 62, I finished the base of the tree, continued detailing my path with some mossy cobblestone, and then replaced more of the torches with lanterns to improve the aesthetic of things now that I had a proper iron farm. To help with the torch spam inside my crop fields, I hung some lanterns from the ceiling using walls and chains, and it looked really good. I finished the day harvesting my crops. I wasted the first half of day 63 re-rolling enchantments until I decided to add another librarian to my trading hall, which I re-rolled until they sold a looting 2 book. I added this to my sword, which meant I finally had the full looting 3 effect. I cooked some food, brewed some fire resistance potions, and then headed into the nether. I finally made it back to the nether fortress on day 64, where I mindlessly ran around killing wither skeletons all day in search of more of their skulls. It wasn't until halfway through day 65 when I got the second skull, bringing our total collection up to 3, which was enough to fight the wither. I headed home and immediately went deep into the earth to begin digging out a tunnel where I would take on this boss. I dug out a small room and summoned the wither with a potion of healing and a bucket of milk on the ready. As it turns out, fighting the wither in 1.18 is even easier than in current versions because Deep Slate has a higher blast resistance than stone, meaning these underground fights are even more advantageous than before. The fight lasted all of a minute, and although I lost about half my hearts, I felt in control the entire time. I went back home with my newly acquired nether star. I didn't have quite enough iron yet to make a beacon base, so on day 66 I chopped down a bunch of spruce trees and then decorated my enchantment setup. At this point I wanted to start making the cave base look better, and this was a good place to start. I finished the day with some target practice and then detailed the walls with a bunch of moss. On day 67 I collected a bunch of deep slate and then did some reshaping of the cave base outskirts to improve the aesthetic. I'll be honest and say I did not enjoy this task, but it had to be done, so I powered through and did it anyway. On day 68 I returned back to the surface, collected even more spruce wood, and then began outlining the base of a creeper farm. I found multiple tutorials for this design, so I don't exactly know who the original creator is, so if you know, please let me know in the comments. Either way, that night I added the roof, placed in the trapdoors, and then finally put down carpets to prevent spiders from spawning. On day 69 I killed a couple of salmon and brought them to the nearby village so I could abduct a couple of cats, which I brought back to put inside my creeper farm. If you didn't know, creepers are scared of cats, and this is what funnels all of the creepers to the center drop chute, which I then began digging out. Finally, on day 70 I finished the collection area and removed the torches inside to activate the farm. I filled in the ceiling of the water chute with glass, even though, let's be honest, you couldn't see it through the water anyways. I built all the way up 100 blocks or so and created a platform to AFK for gunpowder without having to worry about lighting up even more caves below me. The farm was working, but still not very well. I spent most of the night AFKing up here to come down to a measly 11 gunpowder, so I got impatient and went creeper slaying myself. I spent day 71 up at the AFK spot again, and this time had almost a stack of gunpowder in the chest. The farm worked a lot better when there weren't surface mobs spawning like there was at nighttime. That night, I decided it was time to prepare for our toughest challenge yet, a raid. I went to the village and put down my beacon and gave myself resistance and regen, and then blocked all the villagers in their homes while they were sleeping for the night. I flew off in search of a pillager outpost. On day 72, I flew and flew and flew, exploring a desert temple along the way until I finally ran into an outpost over 3,000 blocks from my base. I noticed this pillager with a banner was isolated, so I dove in for the kill, giving myself bad omen, which was the only thing I needed to help trigger a raid. It was go time. I flew home that night and quickly slept in the village just as the raid bar was filling up. Ironically, this was the first time I had slept in this entire playthrough so far. Day 73. The first few waves went pretty smooth, except for the fact that I had to go searching for raid mobs that kept getting lost inside nearby caves. I got too close to this Ravager though, and it took away nearly half of my health in an instant, but I managed to take it out. By wave 4 or 5, I decided things were getting a little bit tough, so I built up onto the roof of a house so mobs couldn't get to me. This was the first wave with evokers, which I had to take out very quickly to prevent too many Vex from spawning. I got way too close to these Vindicators who did some serious damage. Luckily for me, I had a totem of Undying waiting for me over here, which I immediately put in my offhand. This was a relief, but the nightmare was not over yet. I continued fighting the remaining waves and eventually had to make a run for it as too many Vexes were overrunning me. Things were getting out of hand. To make matters even worse, it was nighttime and these two zombies picked up my totems of Undying, which did nothing but give them an extra life as I slayed them. Kinda funny though, didn't really realize they could even do that. Finally, in true Minecraft fashion, I found the last few mobs inside a cave and took them out to officially complete the raid. I spent the rest of the night collecting my beacon and headed home to lower my blood pressure a bit. On day 74, I collected my crops and traded with my villagers now that I had Hero of the Village, and even got a few mending books while they were on sale. I was now able to put mending on the rest of my armor and even more tools, which was especially good because my gear was in rough shape from the raid. I spent the rest of the day moving my beacon into the cave base and loaded it with jump boosts, since that would be more helpful than haste 2, especially since you can't insta-mine deep slate anyways. On day 75, I collected even more azalea leaves and spent the rest of the day collecting a bunch of moss down in the lower section of the cave. On day 76, I collected a bunch more spruce wood and then began using it to replace all of the moss I had put down in the path. I decided this would be a better block to use for the path, whereas the moss worked better as a detail block for the walls or any grassy areas. It was now day 77 and I continued detailing my pathway, even adding some barrels and stripped logs into the floor to complement the texture of the spruce planks. I even filled in the areas surrounding the custom tree with a bunch of moss and azalea leaves, which looked quite nice, I might add. I continued the night adding more mossy details to the walls surrounding the base. I spent the first half of day 78 at the zombie grinder collecting experience to mend my gear, but decided it was too slow, so I went out mob hunting that night so I could collect some more useful drops other than zombie flesh. On day 79, I began construction of what would eventually be a proper home for my villagers, and I decided it would be a nice way to use the space in this far corner of the cave base, which up to this point I had not really touched. This build was difficult, and I'll be honest, it wasn't my favorite build ever, but I stuck with it, and by the end of the day, I had at least something to show for it. By day 80, I added more different blocks and textures, which really helped improve the look of the build, and then began digging out and extending the spruce path over to this area. I made the path wrap up along the crop farms in front of the new villager area and then back down along the pond. On day 81, I continued filling in the spruce along the path and then added some details with the trapdoors, barrels, and strip logs as before. I finished the night chopping down some dark oak trees. On day 82, I continued adding fencing along the new section of path and then converted the center area to moss. This place was really starting to look like a proper village. That night, I went inside of the new building and began clearing out the area inside, which I wanted to be spacious enough to comfortably house all of our villagers. On day 83, I installed the flooring tile with a couple of deep slate variants and then built up the walls with stripped dark oak, which looked very nice. Side note, stripped dark oak is literally my favorite block in all of Minecraft, so I think it looks good in all applications. I added some cobblestone along the ceiling and the walls to help break up the area into some separate rooms. On day 84, I continued filling in the ceiling and added these cross beams in, which I thought were a super cool detail. I was nearly ready to load this place up with villagers, but first I went to the nearby villages and raided them of every bed and piece of wool that I could find. On day 85, I began insetting all the walls a couple of blocks so I could have a safe space to tuck all the beds without making them take up too much space. They were pretty crammed in there, but I still quite liked the look of them. I added in some workstations to the back wall and unleashed the horde of villagers. They immediately started all climbing this glowberry vine for no apparent reason, and after taking care of that, I had to start moving their beds out into the open to begin luring them over to their new home. One by one, I began moving their beds back into the building until eventually they were pretty much occupying the new space. I had a bunch of fishermen though, thanks to all the barrels on the floor, which I kind of forgot about. I spent day 86 adding some detail to the sidewalls of the village and then continued the moss expansion across the cave base. This was a tedious yet well worth it project. On day 87, I went to the nether to kill some ghast for their tears as well as collect some ender pearls so that I could make some end crystals. These would come in handy, but not quite yet. On day 88, I set off adventuring in search of a warm ocean, which I soon after found, also containing a coral reef. I needed a pufferfish in order to make some water breathing potions. I flew back home and started brewing potions of night vision, invisibility, and water breathing. You see, a while back, while searching for the pillager outpost, I stumbled onto an ocean monument, and it was time to conquer it. I settled temporarily on this small island, drank my potions, and headed into the temple. Now, I have raided plenty of ocean monuments in the past, so this was relatively straightforward, and I took out the last of the 3 other guardians shortly into day 89, and then I made a grave mistake. In a pinch, I drank a bucket of milk to rid myself of the mining fatigue, but totally forgot that all of my potion effects were now gone instantly. I was now unable to breathe, completely in the dark, and worst of all, a target for the guardians. Luckily, I had more potions, so I was able to quickly dart behind this pillar and drink them before collecting the gold blocks and heading back home. I spent the rest of the day AFKing at the gunpowder farm. It was now time to fight the Ender Dragon again. At this point, it was day 90, and honestly, I was running a bit low on ideas, so I thought this would be a fun challenge. I set off to find the Stronghold again, and this time dug right down into the end portal room since I saved the coordinates the first time. I jumped through the end portal, traveled to the center of the island, and then placed in the end crystals, summoning the dragon once again. This time, things were different because I had an elytra and rockets, which made destroying the end crystals much easier and allowed me to get to different angles to shoot shoot the dragon. I still had to be careful though, because colliding head on with the dragon could mean an instant death, even with my totem. Get yoded, dudes. Before long, I delivered the finishing blow to the dragon and even made it home before the day was over. I spent the remainder of the evening doing more chores around the base. I spent the first half of day 91 repairing my tools over at the zombie grinder before deciding it would be more efficient just to trade with my villagers for some XP. After falling into the hole and losing half of my health, I decided it would be a good idea to create a safe way down, so I started building this spruce platform and connecting it up to the path with the staircase. I spent day 92 building up and decorating the walls of this drop chute and decided to dig the floor all the way down to bedrock so this could serve as the proper mine shaft. On day 93, I finished decorating the mine shaft and gave myself a quick way up and down with a water elevator and a drop chute. I spent the rest of the night with my villagers trading a bunch of excess iron for some emeralds as well as some good XP. I spent the first half of day 91 continuing to expand my iron trading empire before heading down into the mine shaft in search of resources. For some reason, I only found redstone at this level, and I don't know if that's the way ores generate in this data pack or just my bad luck. Either way, I went home and spent the rest of the night removing barrels and adding even more toolsmiths to my trade empire. I had a lot of iron to trade. Halfway through day 95, I had traded away all my iron and then used the emeralds in block form as a decoration for my mine shaft. I spent day 96 spamming the surface with torches so that I could AFK at the gunpowder farm overnight without too many other mobs spawning. I spent the rest of that day and all of day 97 AFK above the farm to get as much gunpowder as possible for exploration. At this point, it was day 98, and instead of building something fancy or doing something crazy, I set off to spend my last few days exploring the beautiful generation that 1.18 had to offer. I'm still absolutely blown away at the giant underwater caves and the way they extend so far and long into the earth. I couldn't have chosen a better way to end this 100-day playthrough. By day 99, I found myself in a ginormous desert full of desert temples, which I raided in search of enchanted golden apples, but didn't have any luck. I also found arguably the coolest mesa biome I've ever seen. I don't know if this is a 118 feature or just something I had never seen before, but it was super cool and very awesome. And that brings us to day 100, the final day on this amazing journey. There wasn't anything too special I wanted to do on this day, so I gathered some blocks and started building up to the world height. If you don't know, world height was also increased by 64 blocks in 118, bringing the new max build limit all the way up to Y level 320. Once I got up here, I took a few moments just to reflect on the view, because after all, this was officially the tallest view I had ever seen in Minecraft up to this point. It was also a great time to imagine what the area will look like once the mountains are added to the game as well. Finally, after enjoying the view, I decided it was time to go out with a bang. So I said my goodbyes and jumped off into the abyss down to my inevitable death. Just kidding, I had a totem.